Hello, and welcome to the Fresh Perspectives podcast, where our intention is growing together and leading with love. I'm Peter Callahan, and I believe we have an incredible capacity to continue to learn and evolve as individuals and as a species, and bring way more love and a lot less fear into the world and our daily lives. Changing can be hard. And I found that even if nothing changes, having the courage to see our challenges from a fresh perspective can change everything. I'm really glad you're here. And I'm really glad to be sharing this conversation with Mario Jovan Shaw. Mario does so much and has much love to offer to the world. And ultimately, you can hear a lot more about him on his podcast, the Messy Roots podcast, where actually part 2 of today's conversation is being dropped on the very same day. But just a little bit about Mario. He grew up in Ohio and went to the University of Cincinnati before going to get his master's in education at Johns Hopkins. Then Mario was a middle school teacher for Teach for America. And you can actually still see his face plastered all over their marketing years later, he mentions. Mario then co-founded Profound Gentlemen, it's an awesome name, a nonprofit supporting male educators of color. And now Mario, as you'll hear him talk about, is a mindful leadership coach and trains and develops current and aspiring male leaders of color through his organization, Messy Roots. So in this fascinating conversation that Mario and I have today, he really shares his deep belief in the power of storytelling. If you've listened to some other episodes, you've heard other guests talk about this as well, and Mario just has an incredible story himself and perspective on the value of storytelling. And so we discuss privilege and race and what it's like to hold very different identities as we each do, and some of his experiences, including being the only black tennis player on many of the teams that he played on. So really grateful to Mario for this conversation. Very excited for part 2, but for now, keep it here for part 1 of my conversation with Mario Jovan. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being with me today, Mario. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yes, I am super excited to be here on the Fresh Perspectives. I love that title. That's so cool.
Thanks, Mario. And just to say to everyone, we're pretty confident this is our first of 2 episodes that we were going to be doing our best to drop them on the same day. Hopefully that's happening. And
it's going to happen.
This is going to happen. So this is episode 1. And if you want to check out episode 2, please hop over to the Messy Roots podcast, where part 2 of our conversation is currently happening at the same time. I don't know how we're in 2 places at once, Mario, but
AI, they're cloning us now. I love that.
Yes. But so maybe for context, you and I are both coaches for Relovution, Marissa Badgley's wonderful organization. And so that's how we originally connected. And I mean, personally, I just immediately loved your vibe and everything you're all about, Mario, and getting to know you a little bit more and this brand of Messy Roots and just the authentic vulnerability that you show up with in the world. And I'm just so grateful that you're willing to take the time to share some of yourself with anyone who's listening.
I appreciate it. I felt the same with you. I thought your story was great. I don't know a lot of people from Delaware or that live in Delaware.
I'm actually in Connecticut, but
Connecticut,
similar.
Same state.
Some whitewashed Northeast place. Yeah.
But no, I thought it was really cool. And we've had just like 2 to 3 conversations prior to this, and just like iron sharpen iron, which is like my favorite thing to do as a coach, is learning from other coaches and having the ability to just really grow with each other. So I know that this conversation, one, will help me to grow, and I'll probably be thinking about this for a minute. And then also, hopefully, those who are listening, welcome Messy Roots folks to this part 1. Hopefully you're listening for you to be able to get the context of part 2. But I hope that, it'll help you grow as well.
Thank you, Mario. I have no doubt. No doubt. I really believe we are
Yes.
each other's students and teachers at all
Yeah.
times. Well,
So
And
real.
one of the parts of your message and your brand that you have out there is specifically for men of color, right? So that's part of what
Mhm.
you put out there. And I guess I'm curious, and I love that you have the line underneath and for the rest of y'all too. So I appreciate that. It's kind of the specific and broad. There's a target
Yeah.
market and we're also open, and curious to hear you talk a little bit about those identities. And you and I are very different in that I am a cis, white, straight male born on third base in New England to educated parents. I just feel like there's all this
Yeah.
privilege and I'm doing my best to unlearn and strip away the supremacy, the patriarchy, the
Mhm.
capitalistic tendencies that are trained, conditioned into me. So I'm just curious to hear you if you're
Mhm.
willing to just share some of your ultimately life experience and what holding some of
Yeah.
these identities is like, and help me continue to strip away some of my ignorance as far as you're willing to, because it's also not your job. I'm doing my best to
So
educate
good.
myself.
Oh, no, that's real. I agree. It's not my job to be able to strip those things away. It's not my job. Well, obviously, it's not no one's job to do anything, but it is part of our work to continue to tell our story. And how you interpret my story, how you take in my story and utilize it to help you grow or understand a different perspective is the work that you have to do. So, inevitably, like, I could never do the work for you, right? And I always think about that. I could provide you with resources, but you have to do the thinking. So my journey starts really with my identity, black, queer, male. And, in June, the podcast I was doing was with my father, and we talk about queer issues and things like that in terms of him raising me. And so if you want to hear all of that story, you can listen to all of the other pieces, which has been great.
Was he accepting, Mario? That's just the one, we'll
Yes.
go back. I've started listening to those, but yeah.
Yeah, like he is. And one of the things that he talks about was that, these three strikes kind of like against me as a person. And when you think about white cisgender male, there's typically like no strikes against your life. But when you think about black queer male, being a black male, being queer, there are strikes against you. And you have to figure out how to navigate the world in a way where you know that it's going to be harder for you to live out your purpose, but you still do it. And so the question that you shared around how, maybe there might be white men that might be uncomfortable to even join the space to say, this for men of color. Let's add everybody else for the rest of y'all too. It's about storytelling, and that's the beginning piece. It's about, are you willing to hear my story as much as have heard yours? And I think that's the difference, is that we have heard so many white male stories, and we need to hear more. We need to hear more white men talk and speak, because we need to hear your perspective. We need to hear what, a different perspective, like you just said, how you're trying to unpack certain things. We don't hear enough of that. And then the second thing is, how do we provide more opportunities for us to hear man of color stories? And so I'm excited about getting to hear your story. I'm excited about hearing even more stories. We're not a monolith, no one is. And there's not enough stories in the world. And so I think for us to have that introduction, we must begin with storytelling.
Storytelling. Absolutely. And as we both are also on these two topics, what we haven't touched on yet is leadership and mindfulness as well.
Hmm.
We didn't even, I'd love to get into mindfulness to some degree, 'cause I know it's really near and
Yeah.
dear, the practice to both of our hearts. But even just starting with leadership, one of the experiences I have working with many different leaders is this desire for efficiency and for moving quickly.
Hmm.
And I couldn't agree more with you on hearing stories, to acknowledge the value of stories and the return on investment. If we're leaders, we need to be effective to some degree, be aware of all of the variables that we're trying to hold and move things forward and create value in the world, and reciprocity, giving and receiving love at the base
Hmm.
level. I like to think of it. And stories can just feel inefficient, right? Like, oh, I've got to take this time first. I think of my own story, or sit here and actually pay attention and listen to someone else's story. Like, I have stuff I need to get done versus, oh, this is
Mhm.
extremely valuable time spent for me, for this person, for our relationship together, for our ability to continue to heal and be of service in the world. How do
Mm.
you speak to folks who might not value storytelling in the same way that you do?
Mm. This is why it's so good to have coaches on a podcast together having conversation because that's what makes it like so cool. It's like our ability, I mean, we're trained to ask good questions. That's the iron sharpening iron. So that's such a good question. Immediately what I think about is that it's rooted in trust. How do we trust ourselves? So when you neglect to tell your story, it's usually tied to, do you trust yourself to put your story out in the world where people, and actually I'm gonna take it a step back to talk about inviting in. I love
Mm,
this term because that's something that we've been using in the LGBTQIA plus community is inviting in. And it was started by Darnell Moore. No Ashes in the Fire is the name of his book. Such a great introduction to inviting in. But the concept is that we all have inviting in moments, that we all have a part of our life that we have been hiding. And so when we have this moment where we want to invite folks in and to talk about these experiences, that takes vulnerability. That takes a story to share. And so it decenters this idea of, oh, I'm coming out because there's this norm, right? And if we continue to normalize all of these traditional things like straight, cisgender, white male, then anything other than that is always, this taboo. And so if everybody began to have an inviting in moment and we utilize that language, then now we're creating trust within ourselves that I invite you in and that therefore I trust you to respect my story. And if you do anything that is not kind, right, or is not loving, if you do anything that's not loving to me, I have permission to invite you out as well. And that's the cool part as well. So that it begins with trust. I have to trust myself and I have to trust other people that I am engaging in when it comes to storytelling.
absolutely, Mario. Leading with trust.
Yeah.
Leading. I often think
Yeah.
of leadership as having the courage to go first, to extend trust first, right? To have some amount of
Hmm.
vulnerability. I know we both love Brene Brown. She often talks about not wearing your heart on your sleeve, but sharing enough to begin to create that trust. And that trust is built with small moments over time. And we can have the courage to offer up enough trust to share some of our stories, see how someone responds, and that will either create more space or, like you said, maybe retract. It's sort of now there's a new
Yeah.
indication of, I'm not feeling really safe or comfortable in this conversation. And this is why I love nonviolent communication and just learning how to
Yeah.
speak skillfully so that we can make these offers and requests and put up boundaries in a way that doesn't continue to do harm, that hopefully can at least stop
Mhm.
the pain or the harm in its tracks. And I'm curious,
Mhm.
Mario, just to hear a little bit, and folks can hear about the origin of some of your messy roots and your conversations with your dad. Maybe you could meet us a little bit later in life
Yeah.
where this trust started to develop. And I'm just thinking of how you got into
Mm.
mindfulness and leadership and coaching, and maybe first beginning to trust yourself and having this courage.
Yeah.
Where does this come from for you?
Oh, that's really good. Imma keep on saying it's good. It's all of these questions are gonna be good. Man, I think there's so many different checkpoints. I could think about when I became a teacher that it helped me to really, that was a pivotal point in my 20s that helped me to actually trust myself. I had to trust myself in order for my students to trust me. And then I was a 7th grade English language arts teacher, so I had to trust myself for students to trust me, and for me to establish relationships with them. I mean, that was a big thing. I could look at my teens when I had chosen to really just be, myself in terms of being a tennis player. I was the only black person primarily that was playing tennis. Whenever I go to tennis camps, I was the only black person. And so I learned very quickly what it was like to be considered other. I remember I in tennis, I was listening to R at tennis camp, I was listening to R&B music, That was my thing, but majority of my tennis friends that I went to tennis camp with, who again were white, they were listening to
Lincoln Park.
Blink-182, Red Hot Chili Peppers. I'm trying to think what else was out as well. Avril Lavigne, all of those people, and I was a listener to them. And that was the first time I realized culturally that there was something different that was outside of my neighborhood. And because social media didn't exist at that time. And I do think with social media, definitely, even with TV and things like that and access to YouTube, I think there's a clash of so many different cultures and for folks to be able to know something different. I didn't know anything different. Were those kids, in my teens and in middle school ages, were they accepting to my music? No, but I was to theirs, which was very interesting because they represent the majority. They didn't have to fit in, you know what I mean? This was Oberlin, Ohio, and yeah, I went to Oberlin tennis camp. I don't know the years though, but I think it's super interesting because the way that we integrate ourselves into culture, into community is super, super important. And who's at the gate? Yeah, like who's at the gate that can determine whether I have to learn about you and whether you have or do you have to learn about me, and it needs to be both, right? I think in 2020 was the latest pivotal for me that helped me to gain that level of authenticity. I think it was a collective trauma, whether you acknowledge it or not, with COVID as well as the racial uprising. This was something that was brewing, both was brewing for a minute, right? It just didn't happen overnight. It gradually happened over time. And so I was in Minneapolis where George Floyd was murdered. And that right there was a pivotal moment because we were all in isolation during that time. Remember, that was 2020. That was during the summertime. We was at the height of COVID, looking at the death toll. And we had to typically just individual trauma and with mindfulness, to do it collectively is really the way to go because it helps. We could hold each other's in Christianity, maybe you hold each other's cross or hold each other's burden, the weight on each other's shoulder. But when you're in quarantine, 6 feet apart from each other, you have to hold that by yourself. And there was an additional weight that had to be held as a person of color, knowing that the death toll numbers were higher for us, as well as even the police brutality and feeling that pain. That was big, and I think that that moment helped me to further go into mindfulness and with working with male teachers of color, they also had to go into schools. They had to teach students online for an entire year and a half, and majority of the reason why folks became teachers, particularly a lot of people of color, is because of the connections that they're able to have with kids, and it seemed like that they were losing kids, that they were missing kids. Kids may or may not, you know, show up on a Zoom. The disparities were real around who had technology and who didn't. You could see the background of people's homes now, and everything became real for folks. So I was supporting first responders at that time, which is teachers. That helped me to really push my mindfulness. I got my yoga certificate during COVID. I got my mindfulness certificate during COVID. I got my coach's certificate during COVID. I just got all of these. I was like, okay, I need to like do all of the things because this is so needed. And see somewhat of the direction that I want to go. And that was the messiness. I wanted to get down deep in the dirt with folks and help individuals unpack and really grow their roots. We all start off as a seed. The first thing that grows from that seed is the roots. And if the roots is not strong, then the seed cannot even create a stem and then create leaves and bear fruit if it's a vegetable. I'm looking outside of my window, looking at my patio, have tomatoes growing and banana peppers and all of those things that's growing right now, strawberries. And everything starts with a seed, you know? But and then those roots. But we rarely see the roots. We see the fruits of the roots labor, but the roots is not sucking those things in, then the plant is not getting nourishment. So we had to uproot everything that we knew about America, which we already kind of knew as people of color. And so that's where to say that's a long response. I'm sorry, but like that's how I see it right now. Is just man, I think there's checkpoints in folks' lives to say, okay, this happened to me. How do I respond to it? Do I go into a shell or do I decide to still be my true authentic self? And that might take a couple of months. Maybe you do want to go into a shell. I love last thing I'll say around this is I was listening to Humans of New York. I love that Instagram. And somebody that interviewer asked this person, "What have you experienced lately?" And the guy said that he experienced his wife, I think, and mother dying like months apart from each other. And they said, "What is the best advice you got lately?" And he went to a therapist. He went to a therapist, and the therapist, he shared this, and he said, "I just want to just break down." And the therapist responded to him and said, "You have every right to break down and go crazy, just as long as you come back from it." And I thought that was beautiful because sometimes we do need to just lose it to come back, you know, and to receive that permission to hear that when that guy said to receive that permission was everything for him. It really, really helped him to show up the way that he needed to and get everything out. And I think some of us just need that and then utilize mindfulness to come on back.
Absolutely, Mario. That is mindfulness to me. That is mindful. It's being
Yeah.
with whatever is here. Right? Presence means
Mhm,
being
mhm.
real. And this is what's happening right now. And I
Yeah,
think for me as a coach, that's so much of what I'm trying to do is create the space to invite people to be messy, to
mm,
it's okay not to be okay, right? And to sit in our
yeah,
discomfort, trusting that turning toward being with whatever is happening is much more likely to support our growth and our healing and our connection to ourselves and each other than trying to just paper over it, push it away, pretend it's not happening, which is all fear
yeah,
based, which to me is what's happening largely in this
mhm,
country. Like you said, we all woke up to a different degree around the harm that was happening. And I, for one, felt it deeply. I think as a testament to my practice,
mhm,
it broke my heart to hear more and see the video with George Floyd. And, I was already reading some Ibram X. Kendi in my grandmother's hands and really trying
mhm,
to wrap my head around these things. My wife is far ahead of me in this realm, waking up and I felt it really deeply, and I was privileged enough to be invited to facilitate a Breaking White Silence affinity group for a little while and just help
mhm,
white folks sit with it while there was another group this through Hartford Ensemble. There's another, people of color group,
mm,
affinity group that was happening at the same time. And yeah, just so many opportunities to open up. And yet, the world
yeah,
there's so much fear that it also can bring up this defensiveness, right? And this is where I love not being against others to the degree that we can set boundaries. It can be really clear on what our values are and what's important without needing to be forcefully against anyone. I think people on both sides, the right and the
yeah,
left, who are hyper tribalized, stacking all
mhm,
these identities, you're either this or you're that. And I'm not open to listening to
I
anything I
agree.
disagree with, is doing immense harm. And it's creating no space for
Mhm,
understanding and connection.
mhm,
I shared the Thich Nhat Hanh quote with you. Maybe I'll put it in here now, Mario.
mm,
So Thich Nhat Hanh is a Vietnamese teacher and activist, passed away recently. And he has this quote that I love where he says,
mhm,
"We are here to awaken from our illusion of
yeah,
separateness." And I really
mhm,
believe that it's an illusion and that the more we can unlearn and strip away all these things that have gotten in the way of our hearts and really reconnect to our roots, to your point, and how interconnected we all are, it just creates much more space for connection and for
yeah,
well-being and to listen to our hearts and be authentic and honest with ourselves rather than just operate trying to keep up with the Joneses and let fear run our lives. I don't know. I know this is a little abstract, but it's certainly what I'm trying to do.
you're so good. No, it's so good. I use Thich Nhat Hanh and help folks to become coaches. That's my favorite. I love the teaching part. I realized I like teaching. I just didn't like teaching in a traditional sense. I like the pastoral care. I just didn't like the pastoral care in a traditional sense. So combining all that, hey, I'm a coach. And I love Thich Nhat Hanh's work. I didn't know he recently passed, so that's so interesting. It hit me, and it's so it's I don't know if you know this. It was like, we're on camera, and so my light for my plant, um, just came on because they're timed, and so I didn't want you to think that, like, all of a sudden, it's like I don't know if you noticed, like, this bright light just started showing up on my face, 'cause I was like, so I just moved it a little bit. I was like, I don't want him to think that, like, the ghost or the spirit of that I just showed up in this space in his room. Uh, I would invite it in, but it literally, as soon as you got done with the code, it was like I was like, "Oh my god." He probably thinks I'm really wooing out as
No,
he's
that's
talking
that's
about
beautiful. That
mindfulness.
reminds me of the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, one of my favorites. I'm sure you know it. Darkness cannot drive
Yes.
out darkness. Only light can do that.
Only like
Right? Hate
can.
cannot drive out hate.
Yes.
Only love can do that. So I just assumed that was your light
And
coming through,
that's
my friend.
Yes, and that's the thing that I thought was very good about, your line for your podcast, that leading with love, peace, and how many men don't do that, right? Like, how many men choose to not lead, with love, instead we lead with
'Cause we're
power,
afraid.
and so afraid. And if and it's like if we could lead with power, then it puts the mask on, right? I think there is a lot that we have to do in terms of how we raise men. And I still do think that we're moving the needle forward, but then at the same time, you're doing something right. Actually, it maybe the spirit of Thich Nhat Hanh just came to me because I was about to say something different, but you're doing something right when there is opposition. You know what I mean? And right now, there's a lot of opposition around really clear cut lines of what a man is and what a woman is. You see that with trans rights type of thing. And that's just not how life is. Life does not have to be that way. We get to choose how we want to show up. And right now, when we look at, I know it's a sensitive topic, but when we do look at the shootings that happen in schools, overwhelmingly white men. So clearly we are doing something wrong, but nobody is willing to talk about it. Actually, let me even take that back. There are folks that are willing to talk about it. On a national platform, we are seeing opposition, but in local circles and in circles that I have the privilege of being in, I am hearing white men talk about we need to have conversations about emotions. We need to have conversations about love. What does it look like? How to apologize when you're wrong, because you're going to get it wrong. All of us are going to get it wrong. And there has to be that grace. And that's why I believe that, this healing work, this development work has to happen in more one on one settings. It has to happen more in conversations and connecting with people. And it starts with storytelling. But that leading with love is, man, I call it heart work instead of hard work. And that's my favorite. And I got that from a Black woman, Erin Barksdale. She is a principal here at Charlotte. And I actually had worked for her when she was an assistant principal. I was a teacher at the time. And she said one of her first words was, "This is not hard work. This is heart work because we lead with our heart." And it is something that we must continue to reflect on and think about as men. And let me tell you, as men of color, it's even more work because the complex piece about it is that we adopted white patriarchy, which is a big thing, right? Bell Hooks' book. Ooh, you could go heavy on all the things. The Will to Change by Bell Hooks is all about man transitioning from power to love. That book is hard to read. It's a hard read because you literally have to understand how you're showing up in your patriarchy and what you have chosen to adopt. And your story begins there. So that's that piece. Yeah. I love doing that hard work and I love doing it with men. And so like even I have a mindfulness leadership retreat for men of color, more specifically, so that we could have these conversations in person. I do them even online as well. And go deep into it. It gets real and you have to sit with yourself. But all of those retreats start with a story of self. Leading with love. How do we connect? And a diversity with that. because we have trans men, we have queer men, we have cisgender men all coming together to say, "Oh, man," like, we talked about Dr. Brené Brown as well. I love when she say, "Once you hear somebody's story, you can no longer ignore it,
Yes.
or you're ignorant," you know? So I think that's a real.
Yes, and it's hard to hate up close, right? You hear about all these clan members who have been
Ooh.
converted by just
Mhm.
listening, being open to and taking in these stories, and I'd love to go back to your story a little bit, Mari, if you're up for it. I really appreciate everything you're saying and, acknowledging it's harder for people of color in general, for Black men specifically, and yet they're not the ones who are translating that pain. And I love this phrase,
Mm.
pain that isn't transformed is transferred. Right? Whenever we lash out at someone, we're projecting
Mhm.
some wound in ourselves onto them rather than, and this is what mindfulness helps us do, recognize what's happening underneath so that we can choose our response, respond instead of react.
Hmm.
But it's still young white
Mm.
men who are choosing to react in this way and try and meet their underlying
Mhm.
needs through this violence. And yet,
Mhm.
from the objective data that I can take in, we have it much better than Black men. So it's so interesting that, and I'm
Mhm.
going back to your story and sort of thinking of our nervous systems, right? As sort of how trauma comes in and where it's held, the body keeps the score. And I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, just from your experience, what it was like how did you relate to being the only Black man at tennis camp? Like, and for the record, I would
Mm.
have been jamming with you on the R&B for sure. I felt really weird being a white guy who just loved
I
hip
love
hop
that.
growing up. And I tried to move away
Yes.
from it in my
Yes.
20s and absolutely came right back. Like, I just love Tupac, Biggie, Dre, Jay-Z. It resonates with me, I think,
I
because
love
of the
that.
courage and the realness and the vulnerability. It's the only reason that
Yeah.
Eminem's the only white rapper I like because he's so vulnerable. Like, here, tell these people something they don't know about. So
Yeah.
just this. But what was that like for you and your nervous? Like, how did you relate to that? And
Mm.
how did it not overwhelm you or make you just want to be somewhere with your peers rather than around all these white?
That is so real. Wow, that's so good. I wanna I'm thinking about so it's so interesting because in my neighborhood, I was ostracized because I played tennis.
Hmm.
And so then in tennis camp, I was ostracized because I was
Wow.
Black. So I think growing
And
up
you hadn't even
playing
come out yet,
tennis.
right? Like,
No,
yeah.
I didn't come out to
All right.
25 years old, but my dad said he knew the whole time. That was on the podcast. That was so funny. But and that was my first time hearing that
Wow.
from my dad. But yeah, I think looking at that, I played on two tennis courts, and it was really interesting. Off of Lakeshore, so in Cleveland, Ohio. So for context, off of Lakeshore, I grew up on Grovewood, and so I went to Humphrey Park. In that neighborhood, I was the only Black person that played tennis, and this is a Black neighborhood. Everybody else played baseball. So this is the street that I grew up on. But then if we got in a car, rode about 15 minutes closer towards downtown and got off on Martin Luther King Street, got to Rockefeller, which is in University area in Cleveland. Rockefeller is a historically Black, known to be tennis court area. My dad played tennis in that area growing up. My godfather did. And so I lived in two worlds, even in tennis, before even going to tennis camps, because I started at 8 years old. My first time playing tennis, at first time ever hitting the ball was at Rockefeller. But because of my address, I was in the National Junior Tennis League. I had to play tennis at Humphrey Park where I was the only Black person. White people who live in pockets of that area played at Humphrey Park, even though Humphrey Park was in a Black neighborhood. They would travel to Humphrey Park to play tennis as a part of National Junior Tennis League in Cleveland. So I was still the only Black person playing tennis in a Black neighborhood. So I was used to that. So I think it was because I've seen so much. I've been able, so I had to always bounce into these different areas. But Rockefeller Park was my favorite one. Still to this day, it's my favorite neighborhood to be in Cleveland, Ohio. I love, and it's so cool because Rockefeller Park sits off of Martin Luther King Drive, and that's my favorite street to drive down because every country is represented on this street. They have a flag, and statues for every country. Everybody got their own
Cool.
monument. Back in 2016, I believe. I think it was before. Yeah, it was 2016. They revamped the African American one. They put the Pan African flag and they created this new. It's so beautiful. You could see the different
Mm,
cultures. Um, and I think it's only the countries that's represented in Cleveland by a certain percentage. So once you get that certain percentage, you get a
very cool.
monument. I mean, these monuments are beautiful. I'm sitting and people walk on these streets. So I always love
Yeah.
culture and love people. And every time I go down that street, it just reminds me like how blessed and honor I was to play tennis on this street. And it just was a forecasting of what I was going to do with my life. I've always been this person that loved to coach people, but I didn't know it was coaching. I just love to ask questions and support them. In a sense, I would use the word help them back then. Right now, I don't necessarily use the word help because they help themselves. I just offer some type of GPS and roadmap to
Right.
tell them maybe you want to go left. But other than that, I think it was that growing up constantly, I've always been other, so I had no choice but to be my authentic self. But I was holding a tennis racket, my friends were holding baseball bats. And then once not to hit me, but to play baseball, because that sounds bad. And then going to, it's interesting because leaving out of Cleveland and going to school at the University of Cincinnati, found out that there was majority black males did not play baseball. And see, for in my neighborhood growing up, that's what black males did. It was baseball, straight up. It was basketball. Yeah. Okay, we'll play basketball in terms of like, you know, or football in terms of just for fun. But baseball was what they had actually like did, the leagues
Mhm.
and stuff. But here's the kicker too. What's funny? I just thought about this. In the wintertime, baseball and tennis is not happening. And I don't know if my dad did. Maybe I'll do a part two of my dad. I ask him this question. But my dad, on both sides of my family, they're bowling people. And so they have a junior bowling league at Palisades in Cleveland on Saturdays. And so my dad created a bowling league because a lot of the fathers in the neighborhood also bowl. And so whether you play tennis or baseball, we did have some basketball people and football people. We all came together though on a bowling team on Saturday mornings. So that's kind of funny. And I think that's where bridged us. So that's that. You got me thinking about a
Nah, this is
lot of
great.
different stuff, which
That was
is
great.
kind of cool.
I really
Yeah.
appreciate it. I really appreciate it. And if you don't mind me continuing down, you prompted so many other thoughts for me. But
Yeah.
just as a way of because these conversations aren't happening all the time, and I've been through a bunch of trainings,
Hmm.
I've done some reading, and I'm very early in my journey still, Mario. But just understanding some of these terms, two of which are coming to mind that I'm just curious your experience with, because I heard you really speak to doing your best to be authentic, even as a teenager, and having these experiences of sort of having these different communities in the same area in your neighborhood and being able to be authentic. And I heard you expressing gratitude. So I'm curious how in touch with that gratitude and
Hmm.
authenticity you were then, because there's these experiences, we often
Hmm.
call them microaggressions. I prefer the term aggressions, just things that are happening. And as an example, I
Mm.
had a time when I was on a train to New York City from Connecticut here, and there was a person of color. I didn't get a full look at him, but he was kind of standing behind me in the seat that I was sitting in. And I just wound up like reaching for, I keep a pocket knife in my pocket, and I just kind of reached for my knife and put my hand on it, not even thinking about it. It just kind of happened subconsciously. And he said
Mm.
something to me. He's like, "Man, what's your problem? Like, I'm just standing here. I'm not threatening you. Like, what's your deal?" And I was like, "Oh, I kind of got defensive. I was like, oh, what are you talking about?" But as soon as I recognized, I was like, "Oh, yeah, I
Mm.
definitely did that unconsciously." Look for this. So
Mhm.
these little microaggressions,
Mm.
these examples of racism that are still in me, that are baked into us unconsciously, come across
Mhm.
all the time.
Mhm.
And I'm just thinking of that and code switching
Mhm.
and having to speak
Mhm.
more eloquently, or, all these
Mhm.
words that wind
Mhm.
up being really offensive, but that can
Mhm.
often keep you safe. And, I've heard of a lot of black fathers telling their children, do not go playing outside at night. Like, you just are not allowed to be running around outdoors in the nighttime.
That's
That's
true.
extremely dangerous versus, for a white kid at 8 o'clock in the summer, it's no big
Yeah.
deal. So I'm just curious, those code switching
Yeah.
microaggression experiences, like, how frequent were they? Like, how did that affect you?
Oh, that's so good. One, I mean, vulnerable moment of what you're sharing around, the pocket knife situation. I mean, and these things are real, and those things actually do happen to us, and it stains us. You know what I mean? As it relates to the code switching, it was very interesting. It was very interesting because, well, let me go back to authenticity growing up. I think that I didn't know it was authenticity at the time. I was also I was a rebel. I think that's really my leading thing. I was even a rebel in church. We didn't have a youth choir in church. I was like, Imma lead it, but Imma go against the pastor on everything that he thinks that needs to be true about it. And so, like, we was supposed to really be dancing, as we were singing because he came from a Jehovah Witness background into Christianity. We danced. I didn't care. Like, it was just stuff like that. I've always been that way. I think over time I figured out what I needed to actually fight for and what I didn't need to fight for. But code switching is a big thing. I consider it a privilege now, but I don't know how much I think we do it all the time. I guess I'm just not aware of it. What's funny is code switching actually the lack of code switching is what helped me to actually start my entrepreneurship career and journey. I was in Teach for America as a 7th grade English language arts teacher. My second year, I wanted to become a recruiter for TFA. They had already been using my face for everything, still use my face for everything. Um, and so those pictures are like over 10 years old. Thank God I look the same. But when I applied, I got to the final round of being a recruiter. I really wanted to recruit because I wanted to support men of color. By the time I got to the final interview, I kind of felt something different um, in their tone and actions with certain interviews. And then it was confirmed when I actually, you know, closed out the interview and I got the call that I didn't get the job and I asked for feedback and the feedback was that I didn't know how to properly code switch. That and this is a white woman telling me this that they believe that I wasn't great at code switch and they believe that I'd be able to help people to get into education as far as wanting to uh, become educators and motivating them around our kids. But as far as talking to deans and presidents and you know professors, I wouldn't be good at doing that because I didn't know how to code switch. And so that eloquent language had hunt me because I took speech in school growing up. I wasn't the best with phonics. Actually, when I found out I was going to be teaching 7th grade English language arts honors at that, I was very nervous because I wasn't the best. I have dyslexia through ADHD, and I found out all of those things actually helped me to be the best person to empathize with somebody who may struggle with telling their story or have an ability to hear stories. I feel like, and I was saying this, sharing this with one of my former friends. I told him that I felt like in 2020 I learned how to read for real. And obviously, I had already taught. I had a multi-million dollar nonprofit at this time, but reading leisurely was not necessarily like a true thing. Definitely like fictional books. Being able to pick up a book and actually read just for the fun of it, I felt like I was entering a new world. I could not put a book down. I was reading so many books so fast because I also learned how to read. I use Audible, right? Like if having dyslexia, with having a shorter attention span due to ADHD, having the book in my hand in addition to listening to the book through Audible has helped me like crazy. And so that's something that I am so grateful that I have been able to actually do. And that helped me to own my story, going back to story, and become even more authentic and recognize that this is a gift to be able to relate to people. And the language that I use is a gift. And maybe I'm code switching. I believe I am because we all do a level of code switching. I mean, from talking to elders to a child to your peers, all of us are code switching. Black people, there's a cost to us with code switching. Without code switching, that has prevented us from getting certain jobs, access to certain, getting certain jobs, like I said. access to certain spaces, and it's just real. And we cannot say it enough, right? Like our faces literally could turn blue because of how often we have to honestly say it over and over again. But it's still good to be able to. We have to say it. We have to say it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all that, man. The relatability I'm hearing there, you said there's a cost
Yeah.
to not code switching.
Hmm.
And I'm also hearing through the story you shared in Teach for America that there's also a
Yeah.
cost to code switching because then you become less relatable to those who your authentic approach to speaking and showing up might be most relatable. Like I
Hmm.
just shared,
Hmm.
I've heard of research where teachers, I shared this on an episode recently, but teachers who are more relatable are far more effective. Students learn much
Yeah.
more from those who they relate to than those who might technically have more skills in teaching. And it's just
Yeah.
this fascinating paradox of trying to exist in this, again, like supremacist patriarchal world of like, all right, which do I
Hmm.
go with? Do I just try and be
Hmm.
myself or do I try and fit in and go along? And I'm hearing you, this word harmony over balance. I'm hearing you doing your best to harmonize both of those while maintaining honesty with yourself, doing your best to be as real as you can,
Yeah.
acknowledging like, yeah, we're all code switching to some degree. Are we doing it for the benefit of others? I also love this term, authentic attunement. I'm going to both be myself and I'm going to attune to the human in front of me. Neither one is priority. I'm going to do my best to hold both of these things. Like I'm going to
Hmm.
be me and I'm going to do my best to not harm you and to be as relatable to you as possible. I can't do that until I get to know you a little bit. I can try by
Hmm.
assuming when I look at you, but we all know how fraught that can be, right? So asking questions, getting to know someone. And I love asking the question, how are
So
you and
good.
what do you need? My favorite leadership questions. What are you working on and how can I help? Or how are you showing up today? And what
Yeah.
do you need in order
Yeah.
to feel okay, to be successful?
Yeah. My favorite question is a coach.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, all that to say thank you, man. Yeah, what's coming up for you?
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. I think that. I mean, again, my biggest thing is that I love again going back to storytelling. That is my biggest piece because it starts with that. I'm realizing the importance of that over and over and over again. Why that is literally so important for us to go with that. We have to. We literally have to. If not, you know, us as people can perish, We have to, and I think we have more access to stories as well. We have more access to be able to tell stories. So, yeah, it's hitting me today more than ever to think about what that looks like. So, thank you.
Of course. Thank you,
Yeah,
Mario. Thank you. And I've
yeah.
got 20 other questions of curiosity that are coming to my mind. And, for the sake of time, I think we'll save and table some of
No,
those.
we
I
have a
wonder if
part
there's any teaser for you. Has anything come up for you that you may want to dig in with me a little bit deeper? Where might we go in the next conversation?
think
Yeah,
where we I think where we're going is how what hit me is proximity. And I'm wondering how technology has created a false proximity and how it's created a true proximity. I feel proximate to you. I don't know how tall you are. I don't know how you walk. I don't know if your breath stink because
usually it's a good chance.
oh my god, because because we have never been in the same space physically, but I do feel proximate to you. I think that proximity when you talked about proximity to the problem, proximity to a person, that right there has truly helped me to recognize that actually this is literally what I need to be. We need to really be thinking about proximity. We need to think about technology and how it is impacting the way that we tell our story and the way that we're able to be proximate to one another, positive or negative. Everybody's talking about AI. We'll probably talk a little bit about AI and storytelling and its ability to impact the way that, it impact the way that people are seeing it. I think as we close, we can no longer. I think one of the things that's really happening as we're closing, I think what we'll probably get to next week is that, um, I think the true reality is that because during COVID and the racial uprising, we were sitting with so many things, we could no longer ignore the true story of what was happening. This true story that of what was going on is sitting right in front of our face. We can no longer tell a false narrative. And I think as we're hearing book bans and things like that that's happening, we're slowly and slowly who is managing our story? Who have the ability to tell our story? Because with social media is more free somewhat because you have algorithms, free reign for folks to be able to, now know my story. You're able to get it directly from me. So that's what I think we'll probably go to. Our
Yes.
proximity.
Yes. Absolutely. Not at all.
Yeah.
I'm so on board, and again, hopefully you don't even have to wait till next week. You can just end this. Well, I think we could just end it
Yeah.
right there. We'll hop over, and
It
then
goes
we're
great.
just gonna keep this
Yeah.
conversation going on the other channel, and
Love it.
maybe I'll cut this one out and share it in the next episode, Mario. But I keep coming back to this James Baldwin quote too that I absolutely love. That you just remind
Mm.
me of so often as you're talking. I might not get it perfectly here, but it's something around not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing
Yep.
can be changed until it's faced.
If it's not
And
fixed.
that's what I'm
Yep.
just so grateful for your
100%.
willingness to face these things with me and to just get messy a little bit and have these conversations.
Get
And
messy. Let's do
yeah,
it.
so thank you so much for today, Mario.
Yes. No
Yeah, it's been an
problem.
honor.
Awesome. Let's make this thing happen.
Part
Part
two
two.
coming soon. Thanks a lot.
All right.
So much love. Thank you so much to Mario for being with me for this conversation. And thank you to you for joining us on this episode of the Fresh Perspectives podcast. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, I would be grateful if you'd be willing to take a moment to subscribe, offer any feedback, and of course, share it with a friend if you think they might benefit from listening. Thanks so much for your curiosity. Wishing you compassion and courage.